All right, guys. So today we are talking about how muscular function changes across the lifespan. So in the first part of this lecture, we'll talk about the muscular system and the features of the muscular system and how they actually change across the lifespan. And then in part two, we're going to look at muscular fitness in early life. So during childhood, adolescence, and how resistance training can influence our muscular system in that stage of the lifespan. In the second part, we'll look at the same thing, but now in late life, in our elderly years. How can resistance training influence our muscular fitness? So when we think about the functions of skeletal muscle, we tend to think that the muscular system, it's all about the mechanical properties of the muscle, right? It's all about the strength and the power. But of course, muscle has a huge range of other functions that we don't necessarily think about when we think of muscle. For example, providing a source of padding, less muscle mass when you fall over to protect your bones. It acts as a metabolic regulator. We saw that muscle is a metabolically active tissue in a previous week. We also see that it's a source of heat. Think about when you're cold and you're shivering. That's your muscles contracting to provide heat. That's a response to being cold. And they also act as a brake, so they slow our movements, and that's going to be really important for those elderly years when we're more prone to falling over. So it's important to understand that skeletal muscle has many, many functions, and its importance in the body is more than just creating movement and producing force. So over the next part of this lecture, we're going to look at some of the key features of the muscular system. So being muscle mass, strength, power, muscle endurance, and we're also going to quickly talk about flexibility and balance as well. So those three there, the strength, power, and endurance, collectively, those components can be termed as muscular fitness. So we're going to see how all of this changes across the lifespan, starting with our muscle mass or our muscle size. So muscle mass, I said it was the size or the weight of skeletal muscle, and generally muscle mass between boys and girls in young years, in childhood, is the same, and it increases similarly in boys and girls up until puberty. Now, in puberty, males are influxed with an increase in testosterone, and we know testosterone, it's an anabolic hormone. It promotes muscle growth, and it's going to really influence muscularity. So prior to adolescence, muscle weight, it's around 27% of the total body weight of a young boy. However, after that sexual maturity and the introduction of testosterone, muscle mass increases to around 40% of the total body weight. So the gender differences in muscle mass become most apparent after puberty, when we have this introduction of the male sex hormones. Now, if we have a look at what happens to our muscle mass as we get older, there is an atrophy in our muscle. So it wastes away. That's what atrophy means, wasting away. And we can see in this graph here, we've got muscle cross-sectional area. So that's if you took a snapshot of your muscle and measured across and saw how much area or volume it consumed compared to the age. And we see there's this decline in muscle mass as we age. So around a 40% reduction in muscle cross-sectional area from 20 to 80 years old. So the key decline there being from around 65 to 70, there's a steep decline, but the beginning of that decline being around 40 years old. So interestingly as well, legs lose muscle mass faster than the upper body. Something to keep in mind definitely when it comes to our functional capacity, because we need our legs to walk around, to take us upstairs, to prevent us from falling over if we trip on something. So it's going to be interesting to see what the consequence of the legs losing muscle faster than the upper body in those elderly years. So, the decline in muscle mass or the atrophy of muscle mass across the lifespan, and especially in later adulthood, is caused by two key mechanisms: the loss of muscle fibers and the reduction in the size of the actual muscle fibers. So looking at these figures here, if we look at the loss of fibers first, we can see this graph. It's got a similar trend to the one we saw before, but this one is looking at the total number of muscle fibers compared to age, and we can see there is a decline in those fibers, and the loss of the fibers actually begins quite young. It begins at around 25 years old, and then obviously accelerates as we reach our older age. If we have a look at the reduction in the size of the fibers, comparing those two pictures, in the young picture, we're seeing all those circles, which are the muscle fibers. There's darker and lighter muscle fibers, which indicate whether they're type 1 or type 2 muscle fibers. And what we can see when we compare the young to the old is that those circles have almost deflated in that old muscle. So the fibers are actually shrinking and reducing in size. So overall, the aging atrophy of muscles is caused by the loss of the fibers as well as the reduction in the size of the fibers. Now, the decline in muscle mass is one of the most noticeable effects of increasing age. And I'm sure you've all seen a picture like this before, where it's comparing the cross section of a thigh of a younger active person, the 40-year-old triathlete, and an older sedentary person, which is the 74-year-old sedentary man. So we can see in these pictures, there's the bone in the middle, that little white circle, that would be a cross section of the femur. The dark tissue represents the contractile components, the muscles. So in this picture, we'd be looking at the hamstrings and the quadriceps. So the quadriceps would be anterior there, and then the hamstrings would be posterior on that picture. And then the white tissue represents the adipose tissue or the fat. And we can see that in the 74-year-old man, the muscle, it's almost just wasted away in that older person. And now, even if these limbs were of the same size, if you take a tape measure and measure the circumference of the limbs, they could be of the same size, but it's the composition of the limb that really tells us what's going on. Okay, so let's have a look at muscular strength now. Now, muscular strength, it's really important because the contraction of skeletal muscle is what makes human movement possible. Now, if we look at these figures, there's a consistent rise in strength from around 3 years of age onwards. And in these graphs, we can see grip strength and pulling strength have been measured for young boys and girls up until 18 years of age. Now, the boys, they're represented by that solid line, whereas the girls are represented by the dotted line. And we can see the trend is pretty similar between grip strength and pull strength. So for boys, we see that strength increases pretty linearly with age until about 13 or 14, when there's this steep acceleration in the strength development. And that occurs with the adolescent growth spurt with the introduction of testosterone again. So grip strength actually increases by 400% from 7 to 17 years of age in boys. Whereas in girls now, there's a linear improvement of strength with age till about 16 or 17 years, but there's no real evidence of a spurt like there is in boys. Now, after about 16 years of age, there's very, very few girls who are able to perform as high as the average strength of a boy. And that works the other way around as well. So conversely, there are very few boys who perform as low as the average strength of girls. So there's a real discrepancy in the strength between boys and girls. And although these figures stop at 18 years of age, strength does continue to increase up until the 20s or 30s when there's a peak in strength. And this increase continues, especially for males. Now, the difference in muscle strength between men and women continues to adulthood as well. And overall, a woman's maximal strength is about 63% of a man's strength. Obviously, there's differences between upper and lower body. So generally, men have a much stronger upper body, whereas girls can keep up a little bit in the strength of the lower body. Now, we see a similar trend in the decline in muscle strength as we saw in muscle mass with age. So strength declines approximately from around 40 years old, and that loss of strength is really accelerated after 65 to 70 years of age. Now, it's been estimated that a 12 to 14% decline in strength occurs each decade from around 50 years old and onwards. And we also see that similarly to muscle strength, similarly to muscle mass, lower body strength declines faster than upper body strength. So we saw before that lower body muscle mass declines faster than upper body muscle mass. Here we have the same situation for strength. Now, the reason behind this is still debated. However, many researchers believe a possible explanation for the greater leg strength loss may be related to an increased disuse of the legs, but no physiological or biochemical mechanisms have been identified up until now. So, the decline in muscle strength with aging can potentially be attributed to the loss of muscle mass associated with aging that we saw previously, or to perhaps some physiological alteration in the muscle's ability to produce force, something like the reduced activation of motor units. And likely the decline in muscle strength, it's due to a combination of these two mechanisms which make older muscle weaker. Now, muscle strength, it's closely related to muscular power, which is the rate at which muscles actually perform work. So essentially, muscle power, it's a combination of strength and speed. And it's commonly measured by jumping tests. So tests where you do a long jump or a vertical jump are used as indicators of muscular power. Now, the age and sex associated variation in the standing long jump are associated or are shown in this figure. And we see a similar trend here for muscular power of young boys and girls performing the standing long jump. So on average, performance in the standing long jump increases linearly with age in both sexes. And after 14 years or so, girls have that slight plateau in their performance, and the difference between boys and girls' performance in muscular power tasks is really magnified during that adolescence. Of course, again, boys having that adolescent growth spurt, that big increase in circulating testosterone, all enhancing their muscular performance. Now, what's really interesting is a recent study of Australian children aged between 11 and 12 years old looked at the secular changes in standing long jump performance across 30 years. So basically what that means is that they measured the standing long jump of 11-year-old children in 1985 and then the same in 2015 and saw if there were any differences. Are 11-year-olds in 1985 better than 11-year-olds in 2015? And what they found was that there's actually a pretty big decline in the performance of the long jump from 1985 to 2015. So around an 11% difference between the kids in the 1980s and the kids of today. Now, this decline could partly be due to the increases in childhood overweight and obesity. It's likely that an increase in fat mass is going to have a negative effect on performance because obviously it's adding mass that doesn't have any functional advantage. All right, now to understand how muscular power is influenced by aging in that older adulthood time frame, we need to have a little bit of an understanding of our muscle fiber types. So we know we've got the slow twitch and the fast twitch muscle fibers. The slow twitch muscle fibers, that's typically our type 1 muscle fibers, and they're really the endurance fibers. Great for marathon runners, they fire slowly and they provide us with continuous energy. Whereas the fast twitch muscle fibers, that includes our type 2A and type 2B muscle fibers, and they're mainly anaerobic fibers. So they're good for the sprinters, the short bursts of speed. That means that they're going to be greatly influencing muscular power. So what we see with muscular power is, if we have a look at this figure, we can see the type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers and how the area of those fibers changes with age. So what we see is with the type 1 muscle fibers, the slow twitch ones, the fiber size isn't affected by age. It's that straight line traveling perfectly horizontally across the graph. Whereas the type 2 muscle fibers, the fast twitch muscle fibers, they actually decrease in size with aging. So the increased age leads to a greater loss of the contractile material of the fast twitch fibers, more so than the slow twitch fibers. And that's due to the reduction in these type 2 fibers. So the reduction contributes to the age-related decline that we see in muscle strength and power. And it's also a part of the reason why we see a decline in strength and speed with age, but endurance capacity not so much. So if we have a look at these two sporting types, the marathon runner versus the sprinter, the average age of a successful marathon runner is 38 years old, whereas the average age of a successful sprinter is 26 years old. Now, there's lots of things influencing success in these two sports, but potentially it is the change or the decline in the size of the muscle fibers, particularly the decline in the type 2 muscle fibers with age, that results in a younger successful age for the sprinter versus the marathon runner. Now, muscular endurance refers to the number of repetitions of a single exercise that you can do without needing stop or rest. So examples, how many times you can do a push-up or a sit-up in a minute, or even it includes isometric contractions. So how long can you hold yourself at the top of a pull-up? Now, muscular endurance, also commonly referred to as the fatigability of the muscle. It's how tired that muscle gets when performing successive repetitions or maintaining an isometric type contraction. Okay, we see here the trend for young boys and girls in muscular endurance tasks. So the figure on your left is looking at the flexed arm hang, which would be how long a person can hold themselves at the top of the pull-up, that example that I gave before. So the score for this test, it's the duration of time that the person holds this top position of a pull-up, either until the angle of the elbow drops below 90 degrees of flexion, or until the child rests their chin on the bar. So we see that muscular endurance improves linearly with age again, followed by a spurt for boys, similar to the same spurt seen in muscular strength and power. Now, the number of sit-ups performed in 1 minute is the next figure on the right-hand side, and this is also a measure of abdominal strength and endurance. So we see again, abdominal endurance improves with age. Sex differences are very small in the abdominal endurance during childhood, and then those sex differences become established in adolescence when, of course, boys have their testosterone boost. Now, the problem with the previous figures was that with the pull-up, hold, and the sit-up test is that they don't take into account that boys are just stronger than girls. So, of course, they're going to be better at muscular endurance if we don't account for this difference in strength. So, what happens during adulthood when we can actually account for these inherent strength differences between sexes? Well, a group of researchers got a bunch of untrained men and women to perform as many repetitions as possible of a bicep curl at a weight that corresponded to their individual one repetition maximum. So in this case, both the male and female participants were working at a certain percentage of their capacity. So likely the girls were lifting much less weight compared to the boys, but they're still working at the same intensity at 80% of their 1RM or whatever the percentage is. Now, what the researchers found was that the females were able to perform a much greater number of repetitions than males at 50, 60, and 70% of their respective 1RM loads. And these results suggest that the endurance capacity of women is actually greater than that of men when the workload is adjusted and when the workload is relatively low compared to the maximum, because at the higher forces of like 80 to 90% of the 1RM, there's no differences between the sexes in endurance performance. And I actually asked you guys a similar question at the beginning of the semester. A man and a woman, both 25 years old, perform maximum repetitions of a bench press at 50% of their one repetition max. Let's take, for example, that the woman's bench press is 30 kilos. That's her maximum amount she can do for one bench press. So she would perform as many repetitions as possible without stopping at 15 kilos. Whereas the man's maximum is 100, so he'll perform as many reps as possible at 50 kilos. Who would be able to perform the most repetitions? Now, most people said the same. That's the obvious answer. That's what I would probably go for as well if I didn't know any more. But I was expecting far more people to say that the male could do more reps. I'm not sure what's happening, but the boys aren't backing themselves on this one. However, we know now that actually at 50% of the 1RM, the female is likely to perform far more repetitions than the male. And a while ago, I actually had two friends test this out. So a friend of mine and her boyfriend set out to test this theory, and they did maximal reps of 50% of their relative loads for 3 exercises. So they did the bench press, the squat, and the deadlift. And I'll tell you that the girl absolutely smashed her boyfriend in all 3 exercises. She performed way more reps at 50% than he did at 50%. All right, now most research on the effects of aging and skeletal muscle have generally focused on the losses of muscular strength rather than endurance. However, there is a decline in muscular endurance with age, but it's not as steep as the decline in strength. And that's possibly because those type 1 muscle fibers are protected with aging. So those endurance muscle fibers, potentially that is the reason why the decline in muscular endurance isn't as steep as it is with muscular strength and aging. Okay, now the ability to perform daily tasks like bending over to pick up some object, bending over to type your shoelaces, sitting up out of a chair, or even eating all have one thing in common, and that's that each of those tasks requires the bending and movement of various body parts. So smooth functioning of the body's joints is what make these movements possible. And flexibility, which is the range of movement within those joints, it's regionally specific. So what that means is that there's little relationship between the flexibility of one of the body's joints compared to the others. So I'll say that again a little bit more simply. Let's take a person with super flexible shoulders. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have a flexible back. It's regional. So we see in this figure here the average results for a sit and reach test, which is a measure of hamstring and back flexibility. And girls, here's where we finally outperform the boys across all ages. So peak flexibility, it's generally achieved in the late teens or early 20s. Now, from there, there's a decrease in the range of motion in many of the body's joints that occur with age. Previous research has shown significant declines in hip, spine, and ankle flexion range. And poor flexibility or range of motion may really increase the risk of injury, could increase the risk of falls and of back pain as we get older. So some of the causes of the age-associated decline in flexibility are listed here. Now, the general cause is the physiological changes to the structures that make up our joints, tendons, ligaments, muscle, synovial fluid, and cartilage. So, for example, muscles and tendons lose their elasticity. Synovial fluid becomes less viscous, which means it loses its thickness. So it goes from being a nice honey-like texture to a watery texture. Osteoarthritis also is going to influence flexibility. 1 in 11 Australians have osteoarthritis, so it's a very common condition, not to be confused with osteoporosis. Also, physical activity is necessary to maintain joint mobility. So with that decline in physical activity that's associated with aging also influences flexibility as well. Now, another important component that fits in with the muscular system is balance. Now, balance, it's achieved when we maintain our center of gravity over our base of support, so over our person, basically. Several factors contribute to the ability to balance, and that includes efficient functioning of the nervous system, the musculoskeletal system, and the sensory system. So they all have to work together to achieve balance. And balance, it's necessary during static activities like standing still, and also during movement like running, or as this person's doing here, some type of handstand. In children, once they develop the necessary amount of muscle strength and sensory function to balance is actually easy for them compared to adults because their center of gravity is lower to the ground. So the further away the center of gravity is from the ground, the harder it becomes to balance. The last time I went skiing, I was absolutely shitting myself. And then you just see this Milo kid zip down the black diamond head first. Next time you're at the snow, look out for those Milo kids. I'm telling you, they don't have any fear. Balance actually becomes problematic at that adolescent stage, particularly at that adolescent growth spurt. And I'm sure everyone can relate to this when you have that big growth spurt and your movements and your body just becomes all awkward. Well, what that is that there's this short transient loss of coordination because your body size increases so quickly. It's almost as if your brain needs to recalibrate to adjust for your different size. Now, we also see that girls outperform boys in balance activities. Now, this could be a function of a lower center of mass, a lower height in girls, or it could be due to other complex physiological mechanisms. In older adulthood, balance is frequently reported as a problem, and it could be due to or it could be related to changes or impairments in the body systems that contribute to balance, like changes in our nervous system or sensory system. And some of these changes include impaired reflex activity, impaired vestibular dysfunction, so functioning of the inner ear, posture changes, deconditioning from disuse, so muscle deconditioning. Even medications can influence balance. Also, dehydration can influence our balance ability as well. So falling is often a pretty big concern related to balance issues in older adults. So falls are a common problem in the older adult. They can lead to fractures, hospitalization, or even a loss of physical function. So good balance, it's a really important skill for normal activities of daily living in that older adulthood time period. So balance activities are very important components of a fall prevention or physical activity program for an older adult. Okay, so what we've seen in this first part of the lecture, muscular fitness increases linearly through childhood and adolescence for both boys and girls. And we saw in most components of muscular fitness, boys have that increase at that adolescent growth spurt, which is associated with the increase in circulating testosterone. We also saw that with age, skeletal muscle mass is lost, and that's termed as atrophy, and that's accompanied by a significant reduction in strength and power as we get older. Okay, so over the next part of this lecture, we're going to look at muscular fitness in early life. So we're talking about how muscular function is influenced by resistance exercise in childhood and adolescence. Now, before we get into the specific early life information, this figure represents the multi-systemic benefits of resistance training. So resistance training is not just good for muscular development, but it also influences many other variables across almost all of the other physiological systems. So this is something to keep in mind as we continue on with the lecture. Now, the following information about muscular fitness in early life mainly comes from this particular paper, which is a position statement on youth resistance training from the National Strength and Conditioning Association. So this paper defines youth as broad terms that cover children as well as adolescents. And we're going to be discussing some of the key points in regards to this position statement, including things like the safety and efficacy of resistance training in youth, general guidelines for programming appropriate resistance training in young people, as well as the effects of resistance training on muscular strength and health and fitness variables in children and adolescents. So firstly, we're going to talk about safety of resistance training in youth, as this is probably one of the biggest concerns for a lot of people when it comes to involving children in resistance training. So I'm going to show you this video and I want you to think about whether this is safe or not. So when you see this video, I think the immediate reaction of a lot of people is that it's not safe. This is a really young girl squatting heavy with probably a very inexperienced spotter there. And this is a post on Instagram. And if you saw the comments on this post, 99% of them are people who are genuinely concerned for that child's safety. However, what we know now is that resistance exercise, it's actually relatively safe so long as they're following a properly designed program and it's supervised by a qualified professional. So youth resistance training, as with most other physical activities, it does carry some degree of risk of injury, of musculoskeletal injury. However, this risk it's not greater than many other sports or recreational activities that children or adolescents regularly participate in. So there was a study that evaluated the incidence of sport-related injuries in school-aged youth over a 1-year period. And what they found was that resistance training resulted in 0.7% of the 1,576 injuries that were reported over that year. Whereas football, basketball, and soccer, they all resulted in 19, 15, and 2% of injuries respectively. So in general, the injuries that are related to resistance training in young people, they all appear to involve the inappropriate progression of training loads. So too much load too quickly, too much weight too quick, or improper exercise technique, which is likely due to the lack of supervision. Now, one of the other, or probably if not the most common concern of youth resistance training is that it stunts growth. Who's heard that before? I know I've heard it many times. Resistance training, it stunts your growth. The more specific description of stunts growth is that it would damage the growth cartilage of the developing bones. Now, this idea, it's mostly incorrect. Now, yes, damage can occur to the growth cartilage, but this is likely only to occur with incorrect technique and maximal or heavy training loads. So there's no evidence to suggest that resistance training will negatively impact growth or maturation. I think the where this comes from is that people see that a lot of weightlifters are short. Now, that's not because weightlifting makes you short. It's because to be good at weightlifting, being short is an advantage. So it's harder for taller people to be successful in a sport like weightlifting. Okay, so there are quite a few program variables that should be considered when designing a youth resistance training program. Now, this is a very, very general guide, and more information is required depending on the goal of the resistance training. Is the goal to increase strength or power? Firstly, you need to start with the qualified supervision. There needs to be a warm-up and a cool-down before and after the session, and exercises should be performed for between 6 to 15 reps for a total of 1 to 3 sets. The program, it should include exercises that strengthen the abdominal muscles as well as the lower back muscles. And the load should be increased very gradually, only between 5 to 10% as the strength of the participant improves. Also, resistance training should be performed 2 to 3 days a week and alternating between a training day and a rest day. So you want to avoid doing 2 days of resistance training in a row without rest in the middle there. Now, during childhood and adolescence, the physiological factors related to growth and development are constantly changing. We're in this real state of change during our childhood and adolescence. And due to the progression of growth, it can be expected that a healthy child will show improvements or gains in height, weight, VO2 max, anaerobic capacity, and muscle strength during those youth years. So it tends to become a little bit difficult to separate the increases in muscular strength due to resistance training or increases in muscular strength that are just part of the normal developmental process. However, we've got very good evidence now that shows that a well-designed resistance training program can enhance the strength of children and adolescents beyond the normal developmental increase. You may have seen this figure before. It shows the development of muscular strength as a result of neuroadaptation and hypertrophy. So in children, the training-induced strength gains are more related to neural mechanisms compared to hypertrophy of the muscle. So without those levels of circulating testosterone that are required to stimulate increases in muscle size, children appear to experience more difficulty increasing their muscle mass compared to adults or older adolescents. Now, training-induced strength gains during and after puberty in males now may be associated with increases in hypertrophy because of the availability of testosterone. Now, in girls, smaller amounts of testosterone limit the magnitude of training or resistance training induced muscle hypertrophy. However, there's other hormones like growth hormone and growth factors, which may be partly responsible for muscle development in females. So overall, there's many health and fitness benefits associated with just regular physical activity in children and adolescents. Now, most of the previous research in this population has focused on activities that just enhance cardiorespiratory fitness. However, recent findings have indicated that resistance training can offer pretty unique benefits for children and adolescents, obviously when it's appropriately prescribed and supervised. So youth resistance training, it can improve one's cardiovascular risk profile. It can facilitate weight control, strengthen bone, enhance our psychosocial well-being. It can improve our motor skills, things like being able to throw a ball, and it can also increase our resilience to injury. Now, something that's quite interesting is the efficacy of resistance training in obese youth. Now, we know that childhood obesity and its associated comorbidities such as type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease risk factors are a really big current health issue. So the question is, should we be getting obese children to perform resistance training? Well, traditionally, obese youth have been encouraged to participate in aerobic activities. However, excess body weight really hinders the performance of activities such as jogging, and it increases the risk of musculoskeletal injuries as well. Additionally, obese youth may actually perceive these prolonged periods of aerobic exercise to be boring or uncomfortable. And recently, it's been suggested that resistance training may offer significant health value to obese or overweight children. So obese youth tend to enjoy resistance training because it's characterized by these short periods of exertion, the short periods of physical activity, and it's interspersed with rest between the sets and between the exercises. And that's actually consistent with how youth normally play. If you look at a bunch of kids in the background, they're not running in circles for 30 minutes. They're darting to one side of the oval and then stopping and playing there, and then running back to the other side and then stopping, and then going over to the monkey bars, climbing on there, stopping. So it's more reflective of resistance training compared to endurance type training. Now, several studies have reported favorable changes in body composition in children and also in adolescents who were obese or overweight after participating in resistance training programs or even circuit weight training, so things like high intensity interval training as well. Okay, so a few key points from this part of the lecture. We saw that a properly designed and supervised resistance training program, it's relatively safe for children and adolescents. Resistance training can enhance muscular strength in youth, whether that's through neural or hypertrophy factors. Now, the development of muscle mass, it's greatly influenced by testosterone and other anabolic hormones. And finally, we saw that resistance training can actually be an attractive form of exercise for obese youth who don't want to participate in aerobic exercise. Okay, so this next part of the lecture, we're going to look at how muscular fitness influences function and health in later life. We'll also go over the effects of resistance training in elderly populations. So we've seen previously that there is an inevitable decline in the physiological capacity of humans as we age. And we just saw that skeletal muscle mass as well as muscular strength is lost with increasing age. So a major current challenge is being able to maintain mobility and quality of life in older age despite this reduction in muscular capacity. And the first step to combating this challenge is to prevent a condition known as sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is characterized by the progressive loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength. And it has a really big impact on obviously exercise capacity, but on an individual's ability to carry out just normal activities of daily living. It's also been highly associated with physical disability, poor quality of life, and even death. So this table shows the conceptual stages of sarcopenia. So there's no sarcopenia, pre-sarcopenia, and then of course severe sarcopenia as well. Now, the normal sarcopenia condition, it's characterized by a low muscle mass, which is accompanied by either low muscle strength or low physical performance. And in order to diagnose this condition, we need to know how to appropriately measure those variables like muscle mass, strength, and physical performance. So the determination of muscle mass, it's usually measured by DEXA. Muscle strength normally is measured by grip strength in this population. And physical performance measures, they can include many different performance measures. However, things like how long it takes you to stand up out of a chair or how long it takes for you to climb 10 stairs are common measures of physical performance. So here we see the prevalence of sarcopenia and pre-sarcopenia in men and women according to age. So for both men and women, sarcopenia there appears to begin at around the 70-year-old mark, and then the prevalence of sarcopenia progressively accelerates into the late 70s and 80s. Now, there's a much higher prevalence in 80-year-old women compared to 80-year-old men of sarcopenia, but overall, the number of pre-sarcopenia as well as sarcopenia cases are very similar between men and women there. So if we take a typical life curve and plot muscle strength against age, what we see is that when we're born, we grow, we reach adulthood, we have some kind of peak in strength there around the 20s or 30s. And then as we get older, we decline in our ability to produce muscular strength. Now, this red line here represents a threshold for independence line. So this line, it represents the physiological requirements needed to perform a task independently. And as you get older, we cross this threshold of independence, and that is when we lose our independence. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in a lot of older people is that they'll have a fall or contract an illness that results in this steep drop in muscular strength, and therefore they cross that line of independence threshold earlier than they otherwise would have. So if we can try to maintain as much of the muscle strength of older individuals as possible, we may be able to reduce the amount of physical disability we see in our older populations. Now, muscle strength, even if we look at grip strength, so you can see in that picture there an example of someone measuring their grip strength. Grip strength is predictive of all-cause mortality. Now, for me, it's hard to get my head around how can grip strength predict my chance of survival in life. Like, it just seems so trivial, but it can. And this study actually looked at the impact of grip strength on all-cause mortality over 40 years. And what they found was that lower strength, independent of physical activity or muscle mass, was associated with increased risk of death or mortality. And that graph on the right, it's hard to interpret, but we just need to know that hand grip strength measured in these 1,000 males is a significant predictor of all-cause mortality. So how can we increase our muscular strength in old age? Obviously, there's resistance training, but what type of resistance training is best for elderly populations? So this study looked at the effects of resistance training 2 times per week for a total of 12 weeks. And they put the participants in 4 different groups. So in one group, they worked at 80% of their 1RM, so pretty heavy resistance training for an elderly person. Another group at 50%, another group at 20%, so that's quite light. And then the 4th group was the control group who didn't do any exercise. And what they saw was that there was much greater gains in muscular strength when using the heavy loads, the 80% of one repetition maximum. So resistance training is important, but the intensity or the weight of resistance training is very important. Now, when you think of an old person working at 80% of their 1RM, they're not trying to do this massive heavy lift, because remember, their 100% is probably pretty light. They aren't very strong. So 80%, whilst it seems like a lot for them, it feels like a lot, but it's not like they're, loading up the plates and stuff like that. Now, when we talk about muscular power, this study looked at the difference between the power production in controls and weightlifters. So this is looking at elderly men, and the white dots represent the untrained men, and the black dots represent the weightlifters. And what this study demonstrated was that 80-year-old strength trained lifters demonstrated similar maximum or average power as that produced by a 60-year-old untrained individual. Obviously, those results suggest that within this age range, chronic strength can effectively compensate for about 20 years of sarcopenic decline in muscle power. So pretty significant effect there of chronic resistance training. So what about resistance training and functional capacity? Because it's not often that an old person needs to perform a maximal lift, but it is often that they need to climb up the stairs or walk down the street to the supermarket. So can resistance training improve the functional capacity of these elderly individuals? Now, this old study, it's like a classic study, found that with resistance training in nursing home residents, they saw a 28% increase in their speed walking upstairs. So that's quite a significant increase in the speed walking upstairs just by including resistance training into their weekly program. And they also had a 12% increase in their speed of walking, or their gait speed as well. So pretty big increases there in functional capacity from resistance training. Okay, so key points from this part of the lecture. We see that elderly individuals demonstrate pretty substantial adaptations in response to resistance training. Resistance training can improve muscular strength and power, which can lead to improved functional capacity and ability to perform activities of daily living. Resistance exercise is also an effective means of counteracting physical frailty in elderly people. Now, although there's no amount of physical activity or resistance training that can stop the aging process, there is evidence that regular exercise can minimize the effects of an otherwise sedentary lifestyle and increase our life expectancy by limiting the development and the progression of chronic disease and disability. Okay, guys, that is all for today.